Let me welcome everybody to the 5th Future Trends Forum. I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm going to be your chief presenter, cat herder, facilitator today. Welcome everybody to the Shindig environment. You should be able to see me. I'm the guy with all the hair waving at you from the top left of the screen. Today I'll be lecturing and presenting and talking through there. Off to your right, and to my left, will be our slides, which will anchor some of the discussion. At the very bottom of the screen, you should see a whole bunch of icons, squares that represent individual people. So we have folks like Jeffrey and Kat and Brittany and Shelley, and David. Uh, as we talk, I'll be talking to you through audio. You will see this through video. We also have the chat room working, and you can see Shelley, Sam, and Ellen have already used it. So if you can't get to the chat room, hi, Lige, glad you could make it. If you can't get to the chat room, take your cursor, put it over your own icon, and look for a box that says I am and chat. Click there, the window will pop up, and you'll be able to see the general chat room. You'll also have the opportunity to chat with individuals. Now, this is an unusual Future Trends forum in that instead of having a guest, the guest is going to be the FTTE research. So we're going to dive into that. And this is unusual. Some of you who are FTTE subscribers know that this is a monthly report that goes out. But what we're doing here is taking a look at the 3 most recent reports, plus the report that's being built for April, looking at trends that are current now in 2016, which may have a powerful impact on what's coming up down the road. So in order to get, just settle back, get your keyboard ready if you like to type in questions, and let's take a look at what the trends could be. So if you could advance the slide, please. Just so you know, those of you who aren't subscribers, FTTE.us is where you can find out more about the Future Trends report. Again, this is a monthly report that's been going on for about 3 years right now. We have a longitudinal record of taking a look at current trends based on current stories, usually news events or research that tells us something about the future of technology and education. And we've been tracking these trends for quite some time, which gives us a sense of which trends are the most robust, which are a little quieter. And if you'd like to subscribe, please go there, click, and subscribe. Next slide, please. Just want to do a shout out to NYSERNet, because NYSERNet from New York State has been very generously supporting FTTE in 2016. We're grateful for their support. Speaking of support, next slide, Shindig. I'm speaking to you in a very delightful way from the Shindig headquarters in New York, right here on Broadway. Very glad for the opportunity. But especially delighted that Shindig has been such a great provider. They make the software work, and they provide the humans who have been very helpful in supporting us every step of the way. Thank you again, Shindig. Now, all right. So what we're going to do today, we're going to take a look at trends that are especially active in the year 2016. So January, February, and March. News items, stories, research, and developments. So this is a very narrow focus, and also something that I haven't spoken about in public that I'm pretty sure almost nobody else has. Welcome, Joe Murphy from Ohio. Next slide, please. So we're going to follow the usual framework of the FTTE reports. That is, the first chunk is looking at the context of education. That is education itself, policies, schools, institutions, developments, along with the things that situate education. So we're talking about policy, talking about economics, demographics, cultural changes, all those factors. Then we're going to take a look at technology bias, look at recent developments in how devices and software are changing. Then we're going to take a look at their intersection in educational technology, looking at current developments there. And last, but definitely not least, we're going to look at some of the trends that cross all of these sectors and build a sense of crisis. Now, along the way, Ellen, can you hear me now? Let me make sure that I'm still plugged in. Is my audio good? Let me know by chat. Good. Thanks, Paul. Now, along the way, I'm going to stop at each point and give us a chance to discuss. So this is not a lecture. This is a quick set of presentations so that we can then compare notes and see where things are. But if you have at any point any thoughts or questions, there's a few different ways that you can respond. One is to go in the chat box. Again, just type in something to let us know what you're thinking about. The second is, at the very, very bottom right of your screen are 2 orange buttons. So one of them, click raise your hand, and that'll let us know that you'd like to speak, and preferably have on video so that you can come to the stage here and we can have a conversation about whatever topic it is that's interesting you. If you'd rather just do it by text, click the ask button. That's a kind of super chat or mega chat, and that'll pop up a box so that you can ask a question for yourself. For those of you who are on Twitter, please feel free to tweet away. You can either tweet at me, that's Bryan Alexander with a Y, or you can just use the hashtag FTTE or both. And we'll be looking for your comments and feedback. Now, let's go to the next slide. Actually, skip this slide. One of the things I just wanted to mention is that when we're talking about current trends, we're not just looking at things that are evanescent and really on the knife edge of the present. We're looking at things that have been building up over time. And this is a word cloud that takes a look at some of the different, basically we took all the reports and put them into a word cloud generator and created this. And you can see a lot of this is verbs. Things are launching or developing or growing, continuing, declining, or rising. You can also see some of the major developments that we've been looking at, everything from MOOCs to blended printing and technology. Next slide, please. And we just give you a quick sense. I'm not going to read the slide, believe me. Just want to give you a quick sense of some of the topics that we cover. So in education, its context, everything from enrollment to intergenerational issues to racial accessibility, remedial classes, other technology. Next slide. You can see here everything from open source, copyright, automation, physical media, social media, streaming, Moore's law. And then the next slide, you can see even more the intersection of everything from flipped classrooms to campus digital security, video and education, virtual reality education, 3D printing across the curriculum. There's a lot of ground to cover. Okay, next slide. Now, when we take a look at what's going on in higher education finance, one of the interesting developments is that for the first time in a couple of decades, we're seeing the reversal of a long time trend. This map shows you what's happened to change state support for public universities and colleges. And you can see from the blue, different shades of blue, we're actually seeing some states spend more money on education than they did in the past. This is a huge change because from 1990 to the present, most states have reduced the amount. And by amount, I don't mean the total dollar amount, I mean the per student amount. So that for some states, they may increase the total amount they spend, but their campuses have enrolled a lot more students. So the actual per student contribution has been declining. But you can see here now that almost a random assortment of states, for Texas to New Hampshire, California, and Indiana, you're seeing some states actually turning around and refunding higher education. So this is a major, major shift. I don't know if this is going to represent a long-term curve. I hope it does, personally, but I think this is an important one to note. Keep an eye on this. Next slide, please. Now, another thing to take a look at in terms of actual enrollment is that college enrollment has been declining. I mean, I've been speaking about this. We've observed this for the past 3 years. The total number of students enrolled in American higher education has gone down for 3 years. But take a look at this. If you break it down by income, the declines have happened across the board. But for recent high school graduates, the real decline has been the low income quartile, or actually the low income third. You can see high income students, students from families with high income. The majority of them, almost 80%, still go to college right after all. Middle income, just about 2/3. But lower income has dropped below 1/2. That's a major, major change. And again, one of the trends that you want to keep in mind is the increasing stratification of American society and how this plays out in education. Looking at a chart like this, we have to wonder, to what extent does American higher education reproduce income inequality, or does it mitigate it? Next slide, please. Now, some of you know I've been tracking internationalization of higher education for quite some time, and all the indicators show that internationalization continues to grow, that we're adding more and more of a global nature for higher education. So a couple of recent stories to point out. Texas A&M is opening up a campus unit in Israel. That's another example of this. And China is actually competing with the United States and Europe now, and that they've opened a campus aimed at all of Asia. So students from Japan, South Korea, to Australia, to India are encouraged to go to their new international hub. So these are just two more signals of the increasing internationalization of higher ed. Interestingly, in the US, we've had some instances of pushback. Some of you may have followed last year the some faculty who criticized the Confucius Institutes, which are created and supported by China. We've seen that increase in 2016. And also this past year, we saw UC Riverside actually turn down a major grant from an Indian affiliated foundation, which wanted to establish endowed chairs in Indian studies because they didn't like the politics of it. We're also seeing state legislatures, not all of them, but an increasing number of them, wanting public universities and colleges to devote more effort to local, i.e., state-based students. So we're seeing a little bit of domestic pushback. I don't know if these have graduated to the level of being countervailing trends. I don't see them reaching a level where we actually slow down attracting students from across the world. But it's important to note those two that are there. Next slide, please. I've been tracking the crisis of some graduate schools, and we've seen that law schools continue to suffer horribly. For example, this takes a look at JD enrollment, and you can see that we have now plummeted to a level of circa 1977. The total number of students enrolled at the JD level has dropped precipitously from around 2010 to the present. This is the most recent data we've got. Again, law schools continue to suffer. This has a few implications. One is that law school is a very popular graduate program. It's pre-law is a very popular way for undergrads to cluster their majors and their academic work. It turns out that the law is getting ever more difficult to work in. I know I can make a joke about how difficult it is to empathize with lawyers, but this is a major, major blow to American higher education. Next slide, please. Speaking of income inequality, there's all kinds of data about how that works. This is a very, very recent report which took a look at how overall wealth has grown in the United States and in the world. And you can see here that this is one quick chart. The very top, this kind of green color, shows that the wealth, not the income, but the owned wealth, the bottom half of the human race, reached a kind of peak around 2010 and has dropped steadily. And you can see from 2013 to 2015, it stagnated and declined a little further still. But meanwhile, the top 62 people in the world economically, the richest of them, have seen their wealth just extraordinarily grow, more than doubling over the past decade. This is another snapshot of income inequality. And again, this has enormous impact across almost everything we do in education. This helps shape, for example, K-12 financing, which helps shape the outcomes of high school graduates, which become undergraduates in campuses. It helps us think about fundraising. So, for example, if the wealthiest individuals continue to accrete more and more wealth, that gives us the incentive to go after them for charitable gifts and donations more than to, say, crowdsource or go after a broader population. On top of that, this makes us think about everything from financial aid to should we embrace open education resources. Next slide, please. Speaking of finance, you've probably seen data like this elsewhere, but this is a most recent one just to draw your attention to that even though we are in nominally an economic recovery, American college and university students continue to suffer very badly from financial anxiety. Let me just draw a couple of key points here. Note that at the very top, we have a majority of students. So this is important to hear. A majority of undergraduates who are worried about having enough money for regular expenses. So food, rent. And that even though, again, in economic recovery, you can see that number has not changed statistically over the past 3 years. You can see a majority being worried about paying for college. Close to a majority being unable to participate in an activity due to lack of money. And activities here, think about sports, think about group life, for example, think about study abroad. And then you can see if you scroll down, less statistically preponderant, but still significant, you can see a whole series of other economic challenges that are not declining, but actually increasing. Everything from having to increase borrowing to pay for costs, working more hours to pay for costs, thinking about transferring to a less expensive college. I mean, it's very clear that within current students, there's an awful lot of financial anxiety. And this has impact on, besides the humanitarian aspect, these are suffering people. This has impact on everything from how we structure financial aid to student work. If you're in an IT department, this changes how you approach student workers, for example, or if you're in a library. This also changes how we think about open education resources. Arguably, seeing this kind of anxiety about costs suggests that we should perhaps push more for free open education resources. Next slide, please. Let me just return to this point about financial inequality, because we have a lot of data about this, and this is, I think, one of the more uh, breathtaking stats. This is from the Pew Research Center, who does really solid social science work. And what this chart reveals is it gives you statistical backing for the intuition that our middle class is in trouble. You can see here a long-term trend from 1971 to the present. You can see that we can argue definitions in a bit, but the population that is middle class has shrunk. It's fallen from 61% to 50, so just half. Now, in a sense, the good news is that the highest in the middle class have grown from 14% of the population to 21%. That's a classic American dream story. This is a success story. But the sad thing is that we can see the lowest and lower middle class has grown from 25% to 29%. And this is telling us something interesting about higher education. Are we, in a sense, are we trying to educate students so they can end up in the upper middle and highest? That's an interesting function. That's different from higher education serving to get people into the middle class. If higher education is doing that, we're not doing a good job, or the forces against us are very, very large. Next slide, please. Now, when we come to look at traditional age students and we think about where they live after college, it's interesting to track to what extent we have a boomerang generation. And this is the best data that I've been able to find. And one is that men and women who have graduated are, some proportion of them are likely to be living with their family after graduation. You can see here that we reached a kind of bottom level from 1960, but after 2000, that number has increased. So we have something almost like half of men go back to live with their parents or other relatives, and 36.4% of women. So this boomerang generation is a real thing. This is a lot of people. And this, again, has implications for everything from fundraising for to wondering what kind of careers we prepared our students for. Next slide, please. Now, perhaps the grimmest note of all, recent demographic analysis has showed an interesting change in mortality. When you look at demographics, one of the advantages they have from forecasting is that they tend not to change drastically over time. So you can look at things like birth rates and deaths and be reasonably confident that they will tell you a lot about the future. Well, one thing that this chart tells us is that non-Hispanic whites are dying at increasing rates. You can dive into this data at great length. One thing that we know is that the death rate of Hispanic whites is higher for women than for men. And this is the exact opposite of what we've seen from Black and Hispanic populations in the United States. And there's a lot of arguments about what's causing this, everything from lack of access to education to bad lifestyles. But this, among other things, helps explain a lot of political agitation in the United States right now. I look at this slide and my one-word conclusion is, aha, Trump. But it also tells us a lot about racial access to education and some anxieties that we have about politics and culture in the United States. Next slide, please. Now, I want to pause. That was a run through a whole series of major trends in education itself and its context. Again, economics, demographics, policy. Let me ask, what thoughts do you guys have about the implications of these for education? I noticed in the chat box, Joe Murphy from Kenyon College says the places where there are large discrepancies between first years and seniors are interesting. Joe, if you could say a bit more about that in the chat. Does anybody have anything they'd like to chime in on about these trends and how they see these trends playing out in education? Again, you can click on the bottom right to raise your hand so you can come up on stage with me and talk on the video, or you can just click the ask button to type a big chat box, or you can just type in the chat box itself. I'll give you a minute to do this. Wow. If you guys are too stunned by all that information, I hate to give you more. So I'll tell you what, let's shift ground a little bit. Let's take a look at technology and technology trends, because this has a different set of impacts. So just as a top level overview, what we're seeing in 2016, the biggest trends that I've been able to determine, one of them is that video and social media remain absolutely enormous. Video continues to grow at ridiculous speed, everything from Netflix to YouTube to video conferencing like we're doing now. Video is increasingly becoming the kind of lingua franca for the human race. And social media just continues to build at a enormous scale. I mean, I'm not seeing signs of either of those slowing down. Meanwhile, 3D printing is continuing to grow. So we're seeing the cost of 3D printing, 3D printers dropping. We're seeing more and more use of it, more implications of it. In fact, Mattel has produced a 3D printer for kids, your own little 3D printer. We're seeing a lot of excitement around virtual reality, a lot of projects. Not a lot of buy-in yet, in part because the hardware is most hardware doesn't support it. The devices that we can purchase, the VR sets, are very, very expensive. We're seeing, nevertheless, a lot of excitement and interest in where that could go. We're also seeing automation continue to grow, ever-increasing deployment of robots and artificial intelligence, and that spooks people a great deal. We're really concerned about the possibility of a high unemployment future down the road, not very far off. We're seeing continued battles about privacy online. Most recently, the spectacular fight between the FBI and Apple. But obviously, we don't have anything like a social consensus about privacy. Now, personal theory is that we are unconsciously aware that our privacy level has plummeted, and we're coming to terms with it, perhaps going through a Kubler-Ross series of stages of grief. Maybe we're now at the negotiation stage. We're also seeing the Internet of Things continue to rise. People building networks that involve inanimate objects all over the place. I mean, these 6 are very, very major trends and they play out over time. Next slide, please. Can you full screen that? Thank you. Now, here in the United States, mobile phones have passed a very important milestone. We were one of the last nations on Earth to figure out that mobile phones act mattered, but we've been trying to catch up with the rest of the world. And you can see here that the greatest number of households in the US are the ones that only have cell phones, not landlines at all. So it's almost a majority, 47%, but it's definitely a plurality. We are now becoming a nation of mobile phone only people. But close behind that, we do have 42% of families with landline and cell phone combined, myself, for example. But you can see the trends there, where the latter group is declining pretty steadily, and the former group is rising very, very steadily. And the percentage of people who are households that have a landline only, but no cell phone, continues to shrink. Over the past 5 years, that has fallen from about 15% down to 8%. I don't see that reversible in any way. So an outcome look at just in a couple of years, maybe next year, will be where the majority of Americans are cell phone only people, a major revolution in American devices. Next slide, please. Well, let's talk about technology. Let me ask you, what kind of trend, before we get into education and technology, what kind of trends have we seen that we should be talking about besides these? Are you noticing anything else that's especially salient? In the chat box, Ellen has asked a good question about Watson. Have we seen much of Watson in higher education? Not yet. The one really major achievement was IBM deploying Watson in medical research. The short version is it basically fed Watson a huge slew of medical journal articles and asked Watson to do a gap analysis about research possibilities. Watson found a bunch. There we go. Haven't seen this done yet at the pedagogical level so far. The verb I'm looking for is Watsonized. I'm waiting to see when we get education Watsonized to an extent. Cognitive computing, I definitely include in automation. That's a catch-all phrase people have been using to include artificial intelligence, powerful algorithms, robots, automation in general. How about the rest of you guys? Well, to make it easier, let me step away from the stage for a minute and invite you guys to take advantage of the Shindig mingling feature to talk to each other. So grab somebody else, grab, say, Kat or Shelly or Sam or David or Autumn, and then have them try and just click on them and pair up so you can have a conversation. Go on, don't be shy. I hope you had a good bunch of conversations, a bunch of people who joined us, so it's really exciting to see. I just had a really nice conversation with Kat, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things that we discussed when it comes to technology. She reminded us that what she was calling quick video media is really growing. So you think about Snapchat, you think about Yik Yak, anonymous or quick fire tools that are really driven by mobile. That's definitely growing. And we also talked about some of the other contours of mobile. We think about, for example, the way that we have reading done on mobile devices, and also that mobile isn't completely uniformly deployed. There are a lot of places where the connections are slow or unavailable. How about you guys? What are some of the technologies that you discussed that you want to hear? There's a bunch of different ways to respond. I hope this isn't that moment in the class where the teacher asks everyone together and the dead silence falls across the whole area. Paul B mentions an AI platform for K-12, not the same scale as Watson. Thank you very much, Paul. We'll have to keep an eye out for that one. And Patrice, speaking of video, Patrice is interested in using Shindig in a MOOC. That's one of the reasons that Shindig was invented, for that kind of massive scale of video. Definitely talk to the Shindig folks, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to talk to you about this. Well, while you guys are thinking, let's add education to technology. Let's look at some of the trends that we're seeing unfold. So, to begin with, we're seeing increased adoption of digital technology by faculty at a very incremental and slow level. This is not a new trend. This has been going on since the 1990s, but we haven't seen any major uptick. And I don't see any forces that would retard that growth, reverse it, or speed it up. We still seem to be at the stage of faculty member by faculty member growing use of technology very slowly at a level. We're also seeing social media controversy. While a lot of staff, faculty, and students put an increasing amount of their work and life onto social media, we're also seeing some blowback, and we're seeing cases. Most recently, also in Ohio, at Oberlin College, a faculty member is in trouble for some material that she posted to her Facebook page. Every week, we see a story like this. So social media, like a lot of technologies, now holds out both the promise of learning and usage, and also of some blowback and some danger. Now, mobile obviously continues to grow, where we see mobile devices just about everywhere. Last night, I was on Long Island Sound, and I was able to pull down a signal and use my phone. But on campuses, while usage continues to grow, IT support for mobile is relatively low. Generally speaking, the BYOD, bring your own device policy, hasn't really caught fire. Increasing number of campuses are doing this, but it's very, very challenging. In the chat box, Sam Anderson says that they talked about the challenges of scaling up in the classroom at large. And he points out two big challenges. One is large variability in infrastructure, which is a major challenge. And for small institutions, you only have a couple of providers, which is not a good bargaining position to be in. David, well, let's go back to automation, because automation seems to be a field of a great deal of interest. Let's see, that's David says that Deakin University in Australia has been using Watson in their student administration system. and calls it a FAC on steroids. That's really interesting. David, can you come up to the stage and talk about this for a minute? You can kick off the slides and put David up. Hello, David.
Hello, David. Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, so I mean, I'm from another university, but I know that Deakin have been working on it for a number of years, and each year they build it up to keep adding questions and things like that. So basically, they used it in the first year as a training engine to accept all questions. So it means that students can go in and ask simple questions, and it relates to their timetable, relates to locations on campus, and it speeds up and provides a lot more personal environment for students to work their way around campus and the questions they may have. So it's quite interesting that once they've got that, it's something that may be able to use across other universities after a period of time.
And maybe this is one where it grows the more it grows. Right? The more information it gets, the smarter it becomes, the better able it is to answer questions, and some kind of virtuous circle.
The physical environment versus the simple questions that students may ask about, how to do my course, what are the prerequisites and things like that. So it's actually quite interesting that they've taken or starting to move down that path, working with IBM, and of course, having talked to IBM on a number of occasions, they're really keen to expand beyond just the medical field. So recently they purchased a weather company in the US. So I think they're going to start integrating a whole range of different elements and start putting that together. So it's actually quite a embryotic area, but I think it's got a lot of merit in it.
Wow, that's a great example. Thank you very much. Can I ask where you are today?
I'm in Sydney, Australia.
Excellent, excellent. One of my favorite cities.
And in fact, if folks are interested in the Deakin, if you do a Google search for Deakin and Watson, IBM Watson, I'm sure they have some material up there. They have some videos of how they were training it and how the project was running. So if people are interested, I recommend they go and have a look and use good old Google.
The first hit I got was an ad for Watson Cognitive Thinking, and it had that was the first response. And the second was ibmwatson.deakin.edu.au. What a great example. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good on you. Thanks for that.
Oh, my pleasure. Patrice, you've got your hand up. Can we swap David and Patrice?
Yeah, so it's more of a question. We're just starting to think about data analytics and trying to get our heads around, what are all the places on our campus that have student data? How do we figure out what those are? Who owns the data? How do we protect privacy? And so we're really trying to connect with other people that are maybe more ahead of us. And I was just wondering if there were any forums or places where people are connecting and sharing this kind of information.
That's a great question. So far, EDUCAUSE and ELI have been one place where people have been discussing this. Another is CNI.org, the Coalition for Networked Information, which is kind of more global, big informatics level. Now, are you from a public or a private institution?
Private, I'm at now.
Well, then have you talked to any of your peer institutions to see what they're thinking?
We're just starting to do that, trying to gather that information, see what people were. But we were wondering, instead of doing kind of one-offs like that, if there was some type of forum or space or community that had already formed that we could join in.
Those the two that I mentioned are the big national and international groups. A local one that I recommend looking to is NYSCIO in July. Have you been to that before? Well, that's an organization of academic CIOs from across New York State. So there's a bunch of SUNY, CUNY people, liberal arts colleges, and it's this July. It's at Skinny Atlee's, which isn't too far from you,
No, it's not.
and a lovely spot. And they have wonderful, wonderful speakers. And Ellen, before I can even finish my sentence, has already put in the link to its organization. So,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, that's New York State only. That's publics and private. That's community colleges and R1s. That's everybody. It's a really nice mix of people. So, now they also are part of AdvisorNet, so they may be interested in developing something larger. Beyond that, I'd go and ask them and see what we can find out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, it's a terrific question, and it's interesting that data analytics and education is the point now where we don't have a vendor solution that people can point to. We don't have a lot of best practices or open standards. This is like the web in 1985. This is really early days. Thank you for raising that. And Kat, you were asking about Shindig. This is one of the things that we can do, is that we can haul people up from the crowd and put them on stage, and we can go back and forth like this. So speaking of the stage, let's get back to education technology, and let's look at the slide where we were and advance one more. So when we look a little further ahead, a little more futuristically, here are a few of the topics that have come up, and Patrice just did a great job of mentioning data analytics. One is that there's a lot of discussion about virtual learning environments, aka the LMS. Casey Green, when he was on the forum a couple of weeks ago, had a great observation. He said the market is mature, but the products are immature. That is, we have something like 98% of campuses have standardized in at least one LMS. Good, that's in place. It's not a new thing anymore. But the products, he said, are still really basic, and some of them are in fact kind of antiquated. So we're seeing a rush for these products to catch up with each other, and they're starting to do some features. Well, at the big level, there's been a lot of discussion about what the next generation will look like. We've had one generation, CT, Moodle, Blackboard, Sakai, all these guys, and Canvas most recently. What does the next generation look like? What does that include? How does that change? So that's a discussion that's beginning to happen among vendors, among academics. Another is we're seeing 3D printing and makerspaces really smaller across the curriculum. So we mentioned 3D printing in the technology segment. When it comes to education, we're seeing this being very exciting. That we're seeing disciplines as diverse as art history, classical studies, biology, engineering, architecture, all exploring 3D printing at different levels. And makerspaces continuing to grow. Now, virtual reality is less well advanced. There's a lot of brainstorming. I know quite a few IT departments that have bought an Oculus Rift, or they've got some Google Cardboard setups. But there's a lot of brainstorming about how this can be different from the way it was in the 1990s. What kind of visualization can be done? Are there possibilities for storytelling? What are the social affordances of virtual reality? And then a little further ahead still, we have the idea of automation. To what extent can we automate functions in education? So we just had this great point about automating a kind of knowledge base for university life. What else can be done? Turnitin.com has an automated virtual writing assistant that can help you revise a paper, for example. We're seeing more writing assessment tools do this. Earlier, I bragged about how fun Duolingo is as a teacher of foreign languages. We're seeing more and more elements like this. So that's something to watch for. I have a scenario where we're talking about this as Tutor Me Siri. That's something to take a look for. Next slide, please. Now, MOOCs, we haven't talked about very much. Audrey and I touched on them. Casey Green mentioned them. But one thing about MOOCs that's important to remember is that even though they've become less popular in terms of media play and discussion in the United States, they still are very large in terms of classes being offered and people taking them, especially worldwide. And remember, a key feature about MOOCs is that most MOOC students are not from the United States. If you're a US citizen and you enter a MOOC, you're probably going to be in a minority, which I think pedagogically and politically is an awesome experience. But we're seeing Europe and we're seeing Asia continue to offer more MOOCs. My alma mater, the University of Michigan, just added a whole ton of MOOCs this week to EDX. So those numbers keep going. We may have hit a hype bubble and a hype crash. In terms of sheer production, MOOCs continue to grow. Next slide, please. Now, if we combine these, all these different trends, people argue about what they mean together. Some people argue that we're in what they call higher education bubble. It is like the housing bubble that we see a whole bunch of new prices way and way too high for people to afford, higher than the value we assign to them. So at some point, there's going to be a collapse. There's discussion of the bubble. I prefer to think about this as a crisis because we have a widespread sense of alarm and urgency about higher education, very different from what we've had in the past 30 years. And where does this go? Well, feeding into this sense from the past couple of months, Patrice and David, I'm going to come right back to you. Hang on one second. We have a few different items that contribute to anxiety. And here's one from Goldman Sachs. I know they're not everyone's favorite agency, but they're a very, very important group financially. And here's one of their arguments. Since 2009, college fees have risen by 10.6% in real terms versus a 0.9% and negative 0.1% change in high school and college graduates' wages. This is an important point to keep in mind, that one of the benefits that we tout for higher education is that we're able to improve people's life outcomes. And we're also saying that it's worth the investment. Well, our ability to invest in that seems to be flatlining while the cost continues to rise. Another data point to have in mind is that the downward pressure on enrollment in the US that I mentioned before just caused Pearson to lay off a bunch of people. They had massive layoffs at Pearson, and one of the main reasons they cited was declining enrollment in the United States. So it's already having an impact. Now, Patrice has a hand up. Can we put her on stage, please? Welcome back.
My question is around MOOCs, and so last spring we did a MOOC called Civic Ecology, Reclaiming Broken Spaces, and the goal of that course was really to have people go out and practice sustainability behaviors. And so the goal was to have an impact on their behavior. So my first question is whether anyone else is doing MOOCs that are more about a call to action and trying to change behavior rather than about learning content and getting a certificate. And my follow-on question is that one of the pieces that we're researching is we're using Facebook groups as a way to develop community, and we were wondering, is anyone else looking at that through the lens of social influences on sustainability behaviors?
Patrice, are the Facebook groups for the MOOC students or for Cornell students?
For the MOOC students.
Okay, so using Facebook as a social function for social learning for the MOOC.
Yeah. And so we found like the group that started last May is still going very strong, and people are sharing, the different types of sustainability practices they've started.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. What do you think, folks? Has anybody here seen anything like this? While you think, Patrice, I'm just putting this in the chat box. There is a massive game built by the World Bank, launched about 8 years ago, called Urgent Evoke. And that, to me, looks, I just put the link for it in the chat. That, to me, looks like a proto-MOOC. It involved several tens of thousands of people, and the game taught them to become more involved in their communities and to practice sustainability. It was a fascinating project. So that might be, it still exists in some form. I'm not sure if it's being played, but I'd recommend looking at it as an example.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. No, that's a great one. Let's see. There are a couple other comments, but they don't answer that question. You might want to take a look at the financial crisis MOOC being offered right now. Tim Guyton is teaching it. So I don't know if it's a call to action or a call to inaction, but that's one. Beyond that, you're talking about activism MOOCs, really, in a sense.
Yeah.
Great topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
David has a question about who are the companies leading the way in VLE. Well, right now, David, the biggest companies in the VLE world, Blackboard is kind of the bear still, the biggest market share of them all. Canvas for infrastructure has been gaining ground rapidly. Moodle is not a company; it's an open source platform, but there are some companies that work for it. But that's still pretty widespread. And I mean, those are in many ways the biggies. Sakai is out there; it's kind of small. In terms of leading the way for innovation, I think all of them would argue that they're all leading the way, that they're all doing new stuff. Blackboard just had a CEO swap. The new CEO is charged with making the product more innovative. Canvas claims that they are, because they're so much more web service oriented, that they can innovate more rapidly. And Moodle, of course, has the open source reforms for doing that. Unless I misunderstand your question, that would be my very, very quick answer. Also in the chat box, Joe mentioned a MOOC being run between University of Oklahoma and the History Channel. Joe, were you shocked because the History Channel has become the pseudoscience channel, or for some other reason? Chris from Shindig, again, History Channel is actually taking much of its programming in the classics to be productized for curriculum pieces. NBC learning something very similar. Interesting. Interesting. TV ad for MOOC. They're normalized. They're becoming mainstream. Again, the hype crash is there, but they're becoming mainline. All right, let's go to the next slide. And let me just make things a little bit more crisis-oriented. This is an excerpt from an account of a discussion by campus leaders, primarily presidents, along with some provosts and deans. And I just want to make sure you hear this quote. Council of Independent Colleges represents something like 1,000 private colleges and universities across the U.S., all kinds, religious schools, liberal arts colleges, and so on. They've been meeting for a while, thinking about ways of reforming colleges. And they came to this point, and I have to read this too, because this is just such a wild thing. And they said, what was up for grabs? What could be renegotiated on campus? What was off the table, and what was potentially on the table? And what was on the table included tenure. The composition of the faculty, meaning how many are full-time faculty or how many are tenured, and the definition of and centrality of liberal arts. That is, if you have a liberal arts undergrad curriculum, do you morph that to include more technical or more vocational components? And then also college sports, the extent and depth to that. Should we do more or less than that? I mean, a paragraph like that is a statement of radical intent. And these guys are putting so much of what we know as higher education on the table for change. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we don't normally see in terms of crisis. Next slide, please. Now, those of you who read my blog know that I've been tracking a phenomenon for a couple of years that I call the Queen Sacrifice. This is another sign of crisis or bubble. Queen Sacrifice is a move in chess where one player deliberately sacrifices their most powerful piece in a gambit to win the game. I pick this as a metaphor for a college strategy, where a college or university ends or cuts back academic programs, and in so doing, removes full-time tenured faculty. I'm not dismissing changes to staff or to adjuncts. Those are very important. But I call this the Queen Sacrifice because this is the essential core of what we think as a campus, that teaching, learning, and research mission. So Queen Sacrifice is when a campus will end a program and lose tenured faculty or tenured track faculty. And I've been tracking this and finding dozens of cases of this, primarily in the American Midwest and Northeast. The usual programs that are ended are in the humanities, not entirely, but usually. And sometimes a campus will shift a little bit of money from that to other, often more vocational programs, including law enforcement or STEM. We're seeing more and more of this happening. And in fact, in the past month, one college president in the Albany area who laid off 6% of her faculty won a business award for this great achievement. And we're seeing that in Louisiana and in Illinois, public colleges and universities are being threatened with massive Queen Sacrifices. And my point is, higher education enrollment and finance is at such a stage now that we are really cutting our very identity, and we have to watch for these sacrifices. Next slide, please. Now, let me ask you, before we talk about next week, what do you think of this atmosphere of crisis? Where do you think this is going? I mean, are we going to see, for example, a rebound to the 1990s, where a growing number of students will come in? Do you think we will use technology to, say, transfer a lot more face-to-face learning to online learning? Do you think we will see internationalization lead to a growing proportion of international students in the US and students going abroad? Where do you see this crisis playing out? Hello, Vanessa. Glad you could make it. We just came to the last slide talking about the idea of a higher education crisis or bubble. So if you'd like to come in, there's the chat box, or raise your hand, or click the ask button. Rodney, why don't you come on up?
You hear me?
Perfectly, and you're in stunning black and white. You look great.
Why, thank you. So I was thinking, as you're looking at the shifts and all of the horrible gloom and doom we were just talking about, I think the U.S. presidential election of this coming year is going to make a huge impact on that and on the way that things go. Because we have one side who is looking to expand community college for everyone, and then we have another side who seems to not really have a plan for education. And I'm afraid in our state we've seen significant cuts in education from the top. And so I work at a community college, and our funding has been slashed dramatically. And so
What
for
state?
me, I'm looking at the presidential election as being, hopefully a bellwether to, better days.
What state is that, Rodney?
New Jersey.
Oh, great. Hey, you're just down the road from me right now. Hold on.
Yep.
Uh, oh, yeah, you guys are having a weird shakeout with some of your small colleges really losing students. And
Yep.
no, that's a very, very interesting problem. That's a very accurate summary, much more elegantly phrased than I would have put it. We do know that Bernie Sanders is pushing hard for free college tuition, public institutions, and that Hillary Clinton has a less ambitious but still pretty ambitious program that's something similar. And the Republicans are not really touching this, except for people criticizing Trump University. This is very interesting because we've seen for the past 10 years, we've seen Democrats putting a lot of pressure on higher education to reform and change, as well as pressure on K-12. And neither of the leading Democrats have made such a call this time. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I think maybe Bellwether is right. Mark Hewlett, can we bring you up on stage?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, Mark.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for taking my question. I'm curious, in terms of thinking about these broader trends, these broad strategies, or things that are happening in higher education, the extent to which these queen sacrifice. I've been curious about these ideas, whether or not these are in some ways a consequence of tenure, right? Because these are really the easiest ways to deal with faculty members who are tenured, is actually to eliminate the program. And not that it's like we think about this as like a crisis or a bubble, or how we think of this might depend on which section of the university you are in. And in a sense, like we have, these huge disruptions in technology. We're talking now on Shindig and everyone's all around the world. That's going to change. It's amazing, but it's going to fundamentally change higher education. And when you have people with tenure, doesn't that become a serious problem, because the workforce is sort of fixed in a way that it prevents that type of rapid change?
Oh, that's a great observation. Where are you based?
I'm at Duke University right now.
Excellent, excellent. That piece in Inside Higher Ed this morning about Duke's general education changes, is that accurate?
Oh, I actually didn't see that piece. I should go check it out. We are having some big changes going on. I'll have to check. Was it positive or negative?
I just skimmed it. I need to reread it, but let us know how it is.
There are big changes. This is a good example. Big curricular changes are afoot. I don't think it'll impact the faculty directly, but in terms of just shifting the requirements, that means that certain faculties, the bread and butter for their departments will no longer be fixed, right? So it's causing problems.
Oh yeah, that can become very political.
Yeah.
Very quickly. I think you're absolutely right. You have to stage something as a queen sacrifice in order to change that kind of allocation of personnel. If we look at in business terms, right, and we have
Right.
a very non-flexible labor force in a lot of ways.
Right.
I think long term, I don't think this is going to be as much of a problem as we continue to shrink the proportion of faculty who are actually tenured, and we increase. I mean, we're having a majority of faculty that are adjunct, and of course, adjuncts are at will employees. So you can, if you decide you don't need so many French instructors this semester, but you need more criminal justice, easy peasy, and turn that around. Long term, that may be the case. In fact, we may just see an outcome where higher education really is more fluid this way. It's fall 2018. It's a bad season to be in classical music, but a great season to be in hospitality. We have those kind of ebbs and flows. It's a wonderful observation.
Well,
Thank you.
and it'll be really interesting. I think we're starting to see more and more centers for teaching and learning popping up. And the question, and certainly as universities try to maintain enrollment or even continue to boost enrollment, having a good product that you're delivering is certainly worthwhile. But it'll be interesting to see the extent to which in the next 20, 30 years these centers for teaching and learning become like workforce retraining programs where you're actually needing to provide the faculty with tools as they're changing very quickly.
Well, that's a good point. And you wonder how many of them are staffed with tenured faculty and how many not. And is this a kind of alternative department? I'm conscious of time. I hate to pause this, but
no,
but
thank you so much. I
didn't
appreciate
mention. Oh, my pleasure. And keep growing the beard, by the way.
Thanks.
We have Patrice and Joe have two really great observations and questions, and we just touch on them very quickly, and then we have to wrap things up. Joe asks a metaphorical and model-based question: is what happens to an institution or industry that's always under stress? Do they get sick in the ways an individual human would? Well, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer to that. I would love to have that explored by critical theory or by organizational psychology or business. I really don't have an answer to that. I have an intuition, but I don't have a good research-based answer. If anyone does, please jump in on the chat box. Patrice adds, how does the shared economy, Patrice, do you mean the sharing economy, like Uber, Airbnb, that kind of thing? And while she's answering, can you bring up the next slide, please? Yes, the sharing economy. This is very interesting. Michael Horn was arguing that some online learning is beginning to become a lot more like the sharing economy. That you have people who would teach online part-time, much like someone doesn't necessarily drive full-time for Uber, but they do it on the side. Or you think about, say, Airbnb, where they're sharing their space. So it's kind of sharing a professional space. So that may increase adjunctification and the casualization of academic labor. So there's that. There's also the possibility that we will see, again, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast, physical version of this, where we, as enrollment declines, that we share spaces with other entities. So we may lease out meeting rooms, conference rooms, lecture halls, that kind of thing. Joe has a great answer to Patrice. Let me leave you guys to that in the chat room for a minute, because I have to tell you what we're doing next week. Next week, which is next Tuesday, I believe, we have for our forum a guest who is a very, very influential writer and thinker about education and changes in that. That's next Tuesday at the 15th, the Ides of March, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, of Anya Kamenetz. She's a prolific writer. She's the author of a book, the first major book on student debt called Generation Debt. A very controversial, influential book, DIY-U, about people making their own education, and a recent, very successful book about testing. It's called The Test. She has a weekly newsletter. You can see a link there, website, and I strongly recommend reading her work, and I really recommend coming back for next week. In the meantime, at my blog, I have the recording and notes from last time, and they're coming up either today or tomorrow. We'll have the recording notes from today coming up in a few days. And in the meantime, tell your friends to come to the next Future Trends Forum, and all of you, come on back. I'll be here for the next couple of minutes, and then I need to go out, brave New York City traffic, and drive on the way home. In the meantime, let me thank all of you so much for your question, participation, your good humor. So Paul, Patrice, Rodney, Mark, Joe, all guys, thank you so much for a real generous conversation. And there on the last slide, there's the Future Trends Report and Shindig if you'd like to learn more. And if you guys are still here and you just want to chat, come up and let me know so we can pop you on the stage. Or you can run like heck, which also happens. Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, Brittany. Vanessa, great to see you. Thanks. Go ahead.